A gute Woche. The Rebbe started off by mentioning that it's the Shabbos before Shavuos, and we read the Parsha of Bamidbar. Now, sometimes it happens that we read the Parsha of Nasi before Shavuos, and sometimes we read the Parsha of Bamidbar. Now, when we think about the connection between Nasi and Matan Torah, the connection is very clear. Matan Torah is the time. As we say in the Bracha, the Birchas HaTorah, we say, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim, in other words, the giving of the Torah was connected to the idea that the Eibishter chose us from all the nations, and that was the idea of Nosei, the idea that he lifted up the Yidden from the situation where they were before by giving them the Torah. On the other hand, when we think about Bamidbar being connected to the Torah and the idea that the Torah was given in a Midbar, so the question becomes, what is the connection between Torah and a Midbar? And not only what is the connection, but seemingly it's just the idea of a Midbar and the idea of Torah are two opposite things. In a Midbar Bechlal, there are two levels of a Midbar. There's a general desert, a regular desert, and then there is the Midbar Sinai, which Sinai, as the Gemara tells us, and says in Chazal, that the Midbar Sinai was a Midbar that not only was a regular desert, but there was actually nothing growing in that desert. There was no plant life at all, which shows us that in a desert itself, it was even more desolate than a regular desert. Now, the idea of being desolate, and especially the idea of Midbar Sinai, as the Gemara says, Sheyar da Sinna le'umi So'elam, which means that the idea of world Bechlal was something that was completely negated through the giving of the Torah and through Midbar Sinai, is just l'chura, the opposite of the idea of Torah. Torah is referred to as being Torah Eir, a Torah of light. And in the idea of light, there are two levels of light. There is a regular type of light, and there is a light which is called the Eir HaMeir, a light which illuminates. And in illuminating itself, there are also two levels. There is an idea that it illuminates, and it illuminates its surroundings. And there's another type of light that not only it illuminates, but rather it causes that the things around it should also start giving light. As we find B'negei Seichel, which is referred to as being Eir, there's Eir HaSeichel, that there is a Seichel which is a person's La'atzmei. When a person's for himself, there's idea of Seichel. And then there's also a Seichel which helps other people understand. And that's the idea of Lilmeid Ulalamid. There's learning for yourself and there's teaching others. And there's teaching others in such a way that the others should themselves be able to learn, which is the Tachlis Inyan of Eir. Teira is Eir. In an Inyan of sight, both that Teira itself is Eir, and also that Teira brings light to all around it, which is seemingly the opposite of the idea of a desert. And the Rebbe explained that what is the idea? That Torah was given dafke in a midbar, and in a midbar itself was given dafke in Midbar Sinai, in the desert of Sinai, which was even more desolate than a regular desert. When a person thinks of Limud HaTorah, the purpose of Limud HaTorah and the Sinas HaTorah was that a person should be united with the Torah. And he should be united with the Torah in such a way that we find that when a person wants to learn, or a person really wants to understand something, when there are other people around him, it could be distracting. The only way to really get involved in something and really understand something is only if you completely become involved with the thing that you're learning, and in such a way that there is nothing else in your world besides the things that you're learning. And even more than that, even in Torah itself, if you're learning a certain part of Torah, so although all parts of Torah are really connected, and through understanding one part of Torah, it could sometimes shed light on another part of Torah. But on the other hand, if you're learning a certain part of Torah to really understand it, the only way to understand it is by feeling that this is the only thing that you have in your world. That the only thing that there is in the world is this particular thing that you're trying to understand in Torah, which is the idea of a desert. When a person is in a desert, there is nothing else there besides you and the desert, and the Torah which is being given to you in the desert, which represents the idea that when a person learns Torah, he's supposed to become united with Torah. And as the Alter Rebbe mentions in the beginning of Sefer HaTanya, that when a person learns the seichel with the muskel and the maskel, Everything involved becomes one thing. He becomes united with what he is learning, which is represented by the idea that Torah was given in a midbar. This idea is also brought out by the idea that by the fact that Torah is referred to as being orientally soy. As we say that the Torah, which is a orientally soy, it's a triple light, was given in a month that was Yarchet Liso, the month which is also the Chedesh Hashlishi. What is the idea that Torah is referred to as being orientally soy? So simply it means, now the simple meaning is that the Torah is divided into Torah, Nevi'im, and Uksuvim. But there's also the deeper meaning that the idea of Torah is to unite the Nesen HaTorah, the giver of the Torah, the Eibishter, with the Mekabel HaTorah, the Jew, that it's receiving the Torah, and the Torah itself, that they become united to the point that they become actually one thing until we could call them Tlisoy, that they are all three together as one unit. And that is the idea of that on Shavuos, that there is Matan Torah, the Eibishter is giving the Torah, and the Jew is being Mekabel the Torah, there's Kabbalas HaTorah, and there's the Torah itself. And the point of it all is that all three, both the Nesen HaTorah, the Mekabel HaTorah, and the Torah should become united. And that is also brought out by the simple meaning of Orientally Soy, which the idea is that the Torah itself is made up of three parts, and also Jews are also made up of three parts, as it says that Jews are Keanim, Leviim, and Yisraelim, so they are also divided into three parts. Because in reality, in the Torah itself, there are three parts. There is the Torah, and there is how the Torah has within itself the Nesen HaTorah, the Eibishter, which is the giver of the Torah, and also the Mekabel HaTorah, the Yidden, which are Kolul, included in the Torah. And that is also brought out by the idea that, as the Rebbe mentioned before, that this point is brought out in the beginning of Tanya, which we find that the first word of Tanya is the word Tanya. Now, Tanya normally means that this thing is a brisa. The famous question is that this first piece of Gemara that the Alter Rebbe brings down from Pei to Gimel the Nida, there are different girsois whether or not it's actually a brisa. So whether or not the word Tanya is actually appropriate. And the word that the Alter Rebbe chose to start off the Sefer was was with the word Tanya. And this word not only is the first word of the Sefer, but it became the name of the Sefer, as we find by the Rabbeim, that when they refer to the Sefer HaTanya, they call it with the name Tanya. And it's Tanya Chelik Aleph, or Tanya Chelik Beis, Tanya Chelik Gimel, until there was the addition. Originally, when the Alter Rebbe wrote Tanya, there were only three parts. There was the first part, Neshara Yichud Ve'amunah, and Igeres HaTshuva. Later on, through the Mittler Rebbe, Igeres HaKedesh was added, together with the Kuntra Sachran, and that was called the Chelik Revi of Tanya, the fourth part of Tanya. And then there's also the Kuntra Sachran, as we find from the Tzemach Tzedek, that the Tzemach Tzedek refers to the Kuntra Sachran as being the fifth part of Tanya. And the Rebbe mentioned, incidentally, that we find that the Torah Shebiksav is divided into five parts. Chamisha Chumshei Torah. So in the same way, the Torah Shebiksav of Chassidus is also divided into five parts. And therefore, we have the five parts until the Kuntra Sachran, which is the fifth part of Tanya. And just like in Torah Shebiksav, the fifth part is called Mishnah Torah. It's a repeat of the Torah through Moshe Rabbeinu. In the same way, the fifth part of Tanya is Kuntra Sachran, which is also it's repeating and clarifying different things that were mentioned in the previous prakim of Tanya. But in any case, we need an explanation why the first word is Tanya. And we find that there's many hasbaras. Of the hasbaras is that Tanya is a certain name which helps people in limud atera and limud pnimis atera. But there's also the very simple meaning of Tanya, that Tanya means to learn. So the first thing a person has to know is that the first and basic part of a Jew is that a Jew has to learn the Tanya, and he has to learn Torah in general, and he has to unite himself with the Torah, and unite himself with the Torah in such a way that he becomes united and he becomes one with the Torah, that the Torah and him are inseparable. And that is brought out by the first word of Tanya. And the Rebbe also mentioned that it would be an appropriate time to again remind people of the importance of learning Sefer HaTanya, which we're dealing even with Chassidim, that learn Chassidus, and they learn deep in Yonim Chassidus. But when it comes to Sefer HaTanya, sometimes they still need to be reminded to learn the Sefer HaTanya. And even in Sefer HaTanya itself, if they are learning Tanya, they would be learning the further parts of Tanya, and even in the first chelik of Tanya, they would be learning the later prakim of Tanya. But the beginning of Tanya, the person asks, well, I learned it already, and I learned it as a child, and as a child I already learned part of it by heart. Especially the first word, I certainly learned it by heart. So on that, a person has to know that everything he has to learn, he has to relearn. And the first thing he has to know is Tanya. Tanya is that you have to learn. And you have to learn in such a way that it should become just like a midbar, that there's nothing distracting you. In other words, you put yourself in a world where the Torah is so meaningful to you that there's nothing that could distract you from the Torah. And just like the Gemara says, that we learn out from the fact that the Torah was given in a midbar, that a midbar is hefker, is something that has no ownership, and therefore everyone could learn, which the idea of hefker is also when you want something that someone owns, so there's a distraction. You have to deal with that person, and then first you could get it. But when you're dealing with something that there's no ownership, there's nothing to distract you. In the same way, when a person learns Torah, he has to learn Torah in such a way as if there are no distractions, period. And that comes to that we learn in Pirkei Avos, this week's Pirkei Avos, which Pirkei Avos deals with the Kinyan of Torah. The name of the Pedic is called Kinyan Torah, and there are the Mem Ches Dvarim, Shahatera Niknas Bem, the 48 things on which, through which we could be Kana, we could acquire Torah. And the last of the 48 things is, as the Mishnah finishes off, Ha'emer Dover B'Shem Emrei Mevi Gula Le'elam, that someone that quotes something, and he mentions who he quoted it from, so then he brings a Geula to the world. And as the Mishnah brings a Raya, Shenamar Vatemer Esther La Melech B'Shem Mordechai, that Esther mentioned it to the Melech Achashverosh in the name of Mordechai. So the Rebbe mentioned that the Tachlis, the goal, the purpose of everything is to bring a Geula Le'elam, to bring a redemption to the world. In other words, although the world is a world which is Elam, which Elam is Miloshin Helam Vehester, there's a concealment on godliness. Nevertheless, we have to bring a redemption to the world. And Esther, as the Gemara says, Esther min ha-Torah minayim. How do we know Esther? Where does the Torah mention Esther? The Torah mentions va'anechi aster panai, that I will hide my face. In other words, the idea of concealment, that godliness is not revealed. And nevertheless, there's the anechi aster, which means that although there's the world which godliness is not in a revealed manner, nevertheless, only in this world where there's the hester, we could reveal the anechi, which the anechi is connected to the anechi havaya likecha, anechi misha anechi, which means the essence of elikus is revealed in this world through this Esther, and that brings the geula le'elam, the revelation to the world. As vatemer Esther la melech b'shem Mordechai, and eventually we come to the other Mishnahs in this Pedic. As the Mishnah continues, that the Mishnah mentions the pasuk chorus al haluchis, and the Mishnah says al tikri chorus el cherus, that the words were engraved on the luchis. So that we darshan that it's not chorus but cherus, ein lecha ben cheden, el misha esik b'teira, that who is considered a free person, someone that learns teira. And we have a general klal which is brought from Shalah, that whenever it says al tikri, it doesn't mean that we're completely disregarding the way we simply read it, but it means we're adding another way of reading it, and they're both true. So in other words, there's the idea of chorus al luchis. Chorus means that it's engraved on the luchis, which again represents the idea that Torah, with the person that's learning Torah, doesn't remain two separate entities, but they rather become one unit, just like when you have words that are engraved in stone. So when they're written on a piece of paper, so actually the letters that are written and the piece of paper are really two things. They're just connected. But when letters are engraved on a stone, so the letters and the stone are inseparable. They become one unit. In the same way, a Jew with Torah has to be in a way of chorus, that it should be engraved in him. Just like we say, B'chukeisei telechu, miloshin chkika, engravement, and only then could we be the Ein Lecha Ben Chayden Elul Mishaisi V'Talmud Torah. That brings the true freedom, and that the freedom eventually brings the redemption, the Mevi Geula Le'elam, until we come to the end of the Mishnah. That Kol Ma Shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu Be'ilami Le'bara Elul L'chveidei, that everything that the Eibishter created in this world, He created for His covet. And as the last Mishnah is Hashem Yimlech Le'elam Voed, which means that the Eibishter's kingdom is forever, and the last word is the word Voed, and we have the two psukim that we say every day. There's the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, which is the idea that a person accepts the Malchus of the Eibishter, and we say that the Eibishter is Echad, He's one, that there is only one unit, and there's no place for anything else. But then we say the second pasuk, the Baruch Shem Kveid Malchusei Le'elam Voed. We recognize that there's a world, and there's a world where we're bringing the kingdom of the Eibishter, and we're bringing the kingdom of the Eibishter to the idea of Voed, which Voed, the word Ayin with the word Aleph, are sometimes interchangeable, but the difference between an Aleph and an Ayin is, an Aleph represents that there's only the Eibishter, the Aleph which is Aluf Shalelam. But the Ayin already shows that there are Ayin Umis, there are 70 nations, and nevertheless, we bring the Eibishter's kingdom into the 70 nations, which means that we reveal the Malchus Shamayim in the world until Hashem Yimlech Leilam Voed, that this is an eternal kingdom because it's an eternal redemption. Big'ula Hamitis Vashleim. The Rebbe continued in the second Sikha mentioning that since it's the Shabbos before Shavuos, it's again appropriate to mention something that was mentioned many times, of bringing the children to shul on Shavuos to hear the Aseres HaDibros. That although the question is, what do the children understand of the Aseres HaDibros, especially when we're speaking about infants, but nevertheless, as the Gemara says, Afal Gav the Ihu Lechazi, sometimes even though he, on his conscious level, actually doesn't understand, but Mazlayu Chazi, which means that his neshama does understand. And also, as the Gemara says, as far as Hakel is concerned, where Hakel, they also brought the small children, and it was Lahavi Schar Lemiviyayim, that those that brought them, they also got a schar. So therefore, again, it's appropriate to mention the idea that everyone should try to see that all Jewish children should come to shul and hear the Aseres HaDibros, and if there's for some reason or another an uncomfortableness of leaving the house without anyone there, or someone, so you could take shifts. And since there's many, usually in a Jewish neighborhood there are many shuls, and in every shul there are also many minyanim, so you could have some people of the household going to one minyan and other people going to another minyan, and in this way seeing that every single Jewish child will go to shul. And since the Gemara says L'kuli alma b'Shabbos nitna Torah, that everyone agrees that on Torah was given on Shabbos. So obviously in every Shabbos there's a connection to Matan Torah, especially the Shabbos, which is before Shavuos, is certainly connected to Matan Torah. So since we find that every Shabbos, as the Rebbe mentioned many times this year, it's appropriate, as the Gemara says, that Moshe Rabbeinu was makal kehilis b'Shabbos. He gathered kehilis, he gathered Jews, and he spoke to them divrei Torah. So especially this Shabbos and the days that are close to the Shabbos, you should gather Jews and mention to them this idea of bringing the children to shul on Shavuos, and see to it that every Jewish child is in shul on Shavuos and hears the Aseres HaDibros. We find also that Shavuos is connected, we eat milchiks on Shavuos. There's a minig that Jews eat milchiks on Shavuos, and it's connected to dvash v'cholav tachas l'shinecha, that there's a pasuk that says that you have both honey and milk under your tongue, which is connected to limud Torah, and referring to the pnimius of Torah and nigla de Torah. Dvash refers to pnimius Torah, and cholav refers to nigla de Torah, and therefore the minig is that's one of the mekados of the minig to eat milchiks on Shavuos. The Rebbe mentioned that seemingly the question there's a question. If you're mentioning Pnimius HaTorah together with Nigla de Torah, why is it that Pnimius HaTorah is mentioned first? The normal Seder, when a person learns, is that first he learns Nigla de Torah, first he learns the revealed part of Torah, And then he first learns the hidden parts of Torah, Pnimius HaTorah. And as we find the Seder, that a child first learns Nigla de Torah, then when he grows up, and he knows Nigla de Torah, that's when he starts learning Pnimius HaTorah. And over here we first mention Dvash and then Cholov. The Rebbe mentioned that by Matan Torah we found that the Seder was just the opposite. That before the Eibishter said, Anechi Hashem Elokecha, and he started the Aseres HaDibris, it says, Vayered Havai al Har Sinai. And the Jews saw as it was Vayered Havai al Har Sinai. And what was Vayered Havai al Har Sinai? As it says, that the Merkava Hilyena came down. Which means that the Jews were actually able to see the Merkava. Which Limud of Pnimis HaTorah is connected to Maisa Merkava. And not only they saw the Merkava, but furthermore, they saw the Reichiv, the one that rides on the Merkava, which is the Eibishter himself. As it says, Vayered Havai al Har Sinai. And as the Gemara says, that they were Reyinis Hanishma. They saw things that normally you aren't able to see, you were only able to hear. Which, as the Rebbe mentioned many times, that Shmiya, when a person hears, it means he understands Dvarim Ruchnim. And here they were able to see things that are normally only come into Shmiya. Which means that they actually saw the Merkava, and furthermore they saw Vayered Havai al Har Sinai. And as the Maimer Chazal says further, that they were Shemenes Hanira, which the Rebbe explained to mean that besides the fact that they saw it, they also understood what they saw. Sometimes a person sees something, and even if he sees everything with all its particulars, but he doesn't actually understand it. What was accomplished by Matan Torah was that they were able to see it, and they were able to understand what they saw. So certainly at Matan Torah, the Jews were given the opportunity. They were given both the hidden Torah and the revealed Torah, and that gives us the strength to be able to be Meisef, both in the revealed Torah and in the hidden Torah. And the Rebbe again mentioned over here the Limud Atanya and Shiuri Chitas as the takon of the Frierdiker Rebbe, that a person should strengthen himself in keeping the Shiuri Chitas, which is Kelul, both Nigla de Torah, parts of Nigla de Torah, and parts of Pnimis de Torah, as well as all other Shiurim that a person has in Nigla and Pnimis HaTorah. The third Sikha the Rebbe mentioned, that we always try to find the remes of the special Kvius, the way Shavuos falls out, or any Yontif falls out, in order to aid in Yirah Shamayim. And this year, Shavuos falls out on Wednesday. And as we have the Siman, there's a Siman, the Siman of Atbash, which is the first letter of Aleph Beis, corresponding to the last letter of Aleph Beis, and the second to the first, also corresponding to the second of the last, the Aleph and the Tov, the At, and Beis and the Shin, Bash. So we find the Siman, as it's also brought down in Siddur, that the first day Pesach always falls out the same day as Tisha B'Av, that's the Tov. Which the Pnimius of this remez is that the Aleph of Pesach, the first day of Pesach, which is the day that the Jews went out of Mitzrayim, gives us the strength to take the Tisha B'Av, which is a day of mourning, that Tisha B'Av should be transformed into a day of joy and happiness. Because the idea of Kimei Tzeischa Me'eretz Mitzrayim Arenu Neflois, in other words, the Neflois that will be Lasid Lavi, when Tisha B'Av will actually be transformed to a day of joy, comes from Yetzias Mitzrayim, from the Aleph of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And then we also have the other Siman, Bash, which is the second day of Pesach, always comes out the same day as the day of Shavuos, which this year it's on Wednesday. What's the specialty of Wednesday? The specialty of Wednesday is, as we learn in Chumash, that Wednesday was the day that Nitlu HaMeiris, that the Eibishter hung up the sun and the moon in the sky, the Moir HaGodl and Moir HaKotan. What does it mean as far as Torah is concerned? That in Torah there's the two parts of Torah. There's the Moir HaGodl and Moir HaKotan, which generally also means Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shebal Peh, because the Eibishter, when he gave the Torah on Shavuos, gave the Torah Bipirusha, with its explanation, which means he gave the Torah, and immediately he gave the entire Torah Shebal Peh, which includes the entire Shas, which is the Moir HaGodl and Moir HaKotan. And in the Gemara itself, it's also mentioned. As in reality, the first Gemara, right away in the beginning of Brachas, the Gemara says, Tana Heichen Koy Akrokoy, that the Gemara is based on the Pasuk, and therefore the fact that we read Shema is something which we know from the Pasuk. the Tana of the Mishnah, the first Mishnah, only mentions when we start reading Kriya Shema. Me'emes Akeid Nishma Barvis. And in Gemara it's also mentioned the idea that Kolu Kol Akitzim Ve'ein Hadavar Toli Ela B'tshuva, that really the time for Mashiach has come. The only question is that a Jew should do tshuva. And what does it take to do tshuva? So there's another Gemara that tells us, the Gemara in Kedushin tells us, that in order to do tshuva, a person could do tshuva with one split second and only thinking tshuva. And as it says in Zayar, that tshuva can be done b'shayta chada, b'riga chada, b'yema chada. It can be done immediately. So therefore, it's certainly the time that Mashiach should come. And it will be as the siyum of the Pirkei Avos. That's when it will be, that we'll realize that Kol ma shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu be'ilami, everything the Eibishter created in His world, le'broi elu l'chvede, was only for His kavod, and it will be that Hashem yimlech li'elam vod. A gute Woche.